Shall we start? We have 19 people already. Give 1 more minute and then we'll start. Is Maureen? I think we should start now. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. We would like to welcome you all to this Taster Lecture. My name is Punam Yadav. I'm a lecturer in Humanitarian Studies at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. IRDR has 2 excellent research centers. One of them is the Center for Gender and Disaster. Maureen is the director of the center, and I am the co-director of the center. We recently won a really huge grant, and we have a lot of interesting research projects coming out of that. We are still growing, and we aim to bring more interesting and innovative research projects. We will keep you informed about that. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, let me also share my screen. I just have a couple of... Yasmin, can you please allow me to share my screen, please? Okay. It's good now. Here. Somehow it's not available to share my screen. Sorry, it's just technical. Why is that? Somehow it is not letting me share my screen. No, it doesn't give me the option. Anyway, let's carry on. There are those some introductory slides. We have some recorded lectures which we'll be playing, but I'll just go through it quickly because I couldn't share the slides. Just wanted to tell you a little bit more about myself. I consider myself as a practitioner academic. I worked with various NGOs and UN agencies before joining academia. I'm still working in close collaboration with various organizations in various capacities. I did my first master's in education mathematics from Nepal. My second master's was in gender and development studies from the Asian Institute of Technology in Thailand. I did my graduate certificate in conflict transformation from the US and my PhD in peace and conflict studies from the University of Sydney in Australia. I worked for LSE for 3 years as a senior research fellow before joining UCL IRDR. I published extensively on gender, disaster, and conflict, so you can look it up on our website if you would like to know more about what I have been doing and my work. This Taster Lecture is part of what we cover in our MSc module. This is a new module which was offered last year for the first time. The module is called Gender, Disaster, and Conflict. I'm the module lead, but Professor Maureen Fordham and I coordinate this module. We designed this module purely on the basis of the gaps we saw in disaster studies. This is the only module that, as far as we know, that brings conflict and disaster together and examines it through a gender lens. Gender is socially constructed rules and norms that are attached to the sexuality of a person. We consider gender as embodiment as well as performative acts in this module, and that is kind of our analytical framing to anything that we look at as part of this module. This module was offered for the first time and it received excellent feedback from the students. So we are quite excited about this module and we'll be offering it again in the next academic year. So women and men are impacted differently during conflict and disaster, not because of their sexuality, but because of the way gender is constructed in our society. If you look at the statistics, you will find more men dying in war than women, and more women dying in natural hazards related disaster events. The impacts of both of these events, that is conflict and disaster, are even worse on gender minorities. Why is that? We ask this question throughout this module. Women, men, and gender minorities experience conflict and disaster differently. These experiences cannot be quantified in numbers. Most of these could only be visible through listening to their multiple stories of lived realities. Therefore, we argue that gender has to be the starting point for thinking about DRR interventions. We discuss theories around disaster risk reduction, conflict transformation, and we critically analyze them through a gender lens. We also discuss various policies and examine them through a gender lens. We invite many experts, academics as well as practitioners, to give guest lectures in this module, which widens the scope of this module. Therefore, today we will have 4 short presentations, 1 from each of us, from Maureen and me, and 2 from our guest lectures, to give you a taste of what these guest lectures will be covering in this module. First presentation is by Professor Maureen Fordham, who will introduce her lecture in a minute, which will be followed by mine, where I talk about a case study of how women could benefit from war and why it is necessary to look at women not only as victims, but also as agents of change. This will be followed by 2 short presentations, 2 minutes each, by our guest lectures, and then we will open it up for question and answer. Please use Q&A function to post your question. Please keep the questions coming as the presentations go along. Now I'd like to hand it over to Professor Maureen Fordham and request her to introduce herself and her presentation for today. Maureen, over to you.
Thank you, Punam. And thank you everyone for joining us. We really love this module. It's our real kind of pet project. Punam comes from a conflict background. I come from hazard and disaster risk reduction background. And we both realized that our own areas of interest have been working in parallel. And we see that everywhere. We see very different journals being used, lists of references, particular theories. There's a lot of parallel work going on, but we also see a lot of very useful possibilities for collaboration and for understanding, as Punam says, the lived realities of people in which they may be in a conflict area, and they also are experiencing some kind of environmental hazard event. And we feel there's a real gap there. So this is what we're trying to bring together, and Punam and I learn as we go along as well. Even though I've been doing this for many years, since the late 1980s, there is still much to learn, still a lot to do. As I said, that's roughly my background. I also coordinate the Gender and Disaster Network, gdnonline.org, where it gives the opportunity for people who are interested in gender and disaster broadly to share their knowledge, their expertise, and all sorts of resources. So that's enough from me for now. I now would ask our colleague Yasmin if she would show the first couple of videos. And a reminder again, we did this morning. We had quite a lot of interesting questions. Please just post them on the Q&A box, and we will get to them after the series of videos. Thank you. So let me talk a little bit about the early days of gender and disaster research and practice. This is a series of images from my 1980s, 1990s beginning entry into this man-made world of disasters. And as you can see, it really is a man-made, man-led world. The images that you saw everywhere rarely had a woman in it actively. They tended to be being rescued. The language used was full of gendered language, man-made, mankind, man and environment. And that's still prevalent today, unfortunately. When I came into this, I came into it with a hazards focus. I was working on flood research, and there was very little interest, very little evidence of gender differences in emergencies, particularly in the global north. There were also very few women in emergency and disaster management. And there was little literature or research for us to depend upon. So when I began working on floods, and I come from a geography, human geography, sociology background largely, I was expecting to see gender appear somewhere, and it didn't. So just to take one journal, I picked the International Journal of Mass Emergencies and Disasters because I used to be an editor of it for several years. And gender didn't really emerge until 1996 and Alice Fothergill's literature review. That was a great introduction. It was somewhat limited by a North American focus and a focus on behavioral psychology approaches. But that's where the gender work was that she could find. 1996 again, Konka's article on women and floods in Bangladesh. Yes, more gender coming from a development arena, which we'd come to expect. But again, it seemed to reinforce somehow that a gender view was a problem for others in other locations. It wasn't until 1999, and then there was a special issue on gender. And you can access all of these online, actually. Well, most of the articles, actually, from the journal. You can download them for free. There's no paywall. And I had an article in there. So the task then, and sometimes, unfortunately, still is, the task was to make women visible in this kind of work. Unfortunately, be careful what you wish for, because we got some visibility, and indeed we still have visibility, but the dominant discourse is around vulnerability. So the images you will see are images of women in somewhat passive mode, definitely images of victims, stereotypical images of women with children, and the emphasis on vulnerability. And I have to emphasize that vulnerability and created risk for different social groups is something we do need to highlight, but it has to be counterbalanced. And for a long time, it wasn't. So making women visible, and it was apparent that this was still a task, whatever the discipline you were working in. And what we found was that those people who were working on disasters tended not to work on gender, and vice versa. Feminist theorists were not looking at how this was expressed, how it was manifested in disaster situations. We learned a lot from development studies, which occasionally included disasters or shocks. But when I tried to use those examples, that research, that evidence, when I was engaging with emergency planners in the UK or disaster managers in North America, they simply couldn't see the relevance. And for them, this was again a problem for others and a problem somewhere else. And the disciplines had a particular flavour to them, and Clara Greed summarises the view of geography as men with beards up mountains, which is an enduring image for the dominant voices in geography for many years. It's quite a bit different now. Sociology dominated by the dead white males of the sociological accepted canon. In disasters, the entrances of gender tended to be around women narrowly, and they were often quite medicalized approaches, biological aspects. But still, worth having a look at Rivers' 1982 article, which I reference at the end. And then development, there were some very interesting work undertaken there. Megan Vaughan's Story of an African Famine, 1987. Megan Vaughan actually is also at UCL. So the gender and disaster evidence base is considerable now, but it still has a number of gaps. So we've got some good data on women, narrowly, and disasters, but not everywhere, and often it isn't quantitative. A lot of the people that got into this, working on gender and disasters, favoured qualitative approaches. Still do to some extent, but we need that balance. We've got much less critical gender data on men and disasters. So what you see is the universal category of men. It's meant to represent everybody, quotes, mankind, but of course obscures so many important differences. We've got very little data still in the disaster context beyond the binary and on other social categories, although again, changing. And we've got practically nothing on intersecting ones and on other subaltern voices, maybe grassroots women's groups, for example, and their active leadership in disaster contexts. We particularly lack good data on the global north, where gender is still seen to be not an issue for us. We lack a lot of studies that bring these parallel worlds of disasters and conflict together. And that is where I would hand over to Punam. But I'll just point out just some of the references that I mentioned and some of the work that I got involved with, starting in 1995 with a study in Scotland, which looked at the way the flood disasters there were impacting on women in ways that seemed largely invisible and did not appear to influence emergency planning or practice. Okay, now I think I'll hand over to Punam for a discussion around the conflict focus. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this second presentation. My name is Punam Yadav. I'm a lecturer in humanitarian studies at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Gender and Disaster. In this short presentation today, I will talk about the gendered impacts of conflict on women Instead of talking about women as victims, I would like to talk about how conflict could become a vehicle for women's empowerment. So the title of today's presentation is Can Women Benefit from War? This presentation is part of my ongoing research in Nepal for the past 10 years. Women are often seen as victims and vulnerable in war and disaster contexts. However, there is a growing interest in examining women's agency in conflict and post-conflict societies. Despite their vulnerabilities in the situations created by conflict, women may be exposed to new knowledge and opportunities which may have positive impacts on their lives. In this presentation, I will talk about the everyday lived experiences of women in post-conflict Nepal to demonstrate the significant transformations that have taken place since the war. We will look into the lived experiences of war widows. Let me give you a brief background of Nepal. Nepal is a small country in South Asia with 28 million population. It is a highly hierarchical caste-based society. There are 125 caste and ethnic groups in Nepal, and they speak 123 different languages. Most of the people live in rural areas, and the main source of income is still agriculture for many. Despite some significant changes in recent years, patriarchy still plays a significant role in the social organization of Nepal. Since marriage is almost universal, daughters are seen as someone else's property. They will grow, get married, and go to another family. That's the mentality people have. This has a huge impact on their upbringing and what they become in their lives. Since marriage has so much significance, both religiously and culturally, women's identity is associated with the men they marry. In other words, women's status in the family is secondary to men. The literacy rate among men is higher than women. If you disaggregate the data further, the literacy rate among women from the lower caste is very, very low. Only 1.6% of the Tarai Dalit, who are the lower caste people from the plains of Nepal, have completed their secondary education. There are still many gender discriminatory practices in Nepal. For instance, despite a legal ban, dowry, child marriage are still prevalent. Still, over 35% girls are married before they reach 18. Chhaupadi system, a practice where girls have to stay in a small hut during their period every month for 4 days, is still prevalent because menstruation is seen as impure. Many women and girls have died due to snake bites and other health problems because of this practice. Let me now talk to you briefly about the civil war in Nepal. The democracy was established in 1990. People had a lot of hope for a better future from the democratic government. However, the struggle over power between the political parties and in political instability led to widespread frustrations among general public. Amid these frustrations, the Nepal Communist Party, the Maoists, announced an armed movement against the government in 1996, which they called the People's War. Their advocacy for equality and non-discrimination, including promises to transform Nepal, attracted many people who wanted to see change. The movement grew quickly, and a significant number of people from the discriminated groups joined. Women comprised over 33% of the Maoist militia. The war lasted for 10 years. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed in 2006. During the war, thousands of people were killed, hundreds of people disappeared, and hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. Young women became widows, and there were a significant increase in women-headed households because of the absence of male members in the family. People lost their property, livelihoods, and social networks. Schools and health posts were bombed. The situation became worse after the announcement of state of emergency in 2002. People felt trapped between the two fighting forces and started leaving their villages. As a result, the country saw a huge migration, both internal migration and external migration. Migration that started as a necessity during the war has now become a trend, which has left most of the villages with only women, children, and elderly people. It has been 14 years since the peace agreement. Despite many conflict-related grievances yet to be dealt with, the government has changed its priorities. Two commissions, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Commission of Investigation on Enforced Disappearances, have received over 64,000 complaints, but they are making very slow progress. And the thousands of undocumented IDPs still remain displaced. Political instability, frequent changes to the government have added further complexity to the socio-political scenario of Nepal. Moreover, a devastating earthquake in 2015 claimed over 9,000 lives and left 3.5 million people homeless. It shifted the priority of the government and the international donors from conflict-affected people to disaster recovery and reconstruction. However, despite all these negative consequences, conflict has also created a positive space for women to exercise their agency. The changes that people have experienced in Nepal within a few years would have taken several decades if there was no conflict. GDP growth was recorded at 0% in 2016. However, in terms of gender rights and the rights of women, Nepal stands 42nd places higher than its per capita ranking, which suggests that political instability and economic growth are not the main indicators of women's empowerment. I'll now talk about the transformative effects of war. Due to the time limit, I'll just talk about one example of cultural transformation, the transformation of widowhood in Nepal. Prior to the civil war, there were strict rules around widows. If you were married or unmarried, you would wear any color of your choice. There were no restrictions for them. If you were a widow, no matter how young or old you were, you would have to wear a white sari. The pictures that you see here are the Indian actresses. The one in a white sari symbolizes widowhood and sadness, and the one in red color is the auspicious color, and therefore it symbolizes marriage and happiness. The rules were very strict for widows, not just about wearing what color they can wear and cannot, but also what they can eat, where they could go to, and so forth. Women were blamed for their widowhood. They were expected to be loyal to their husbands even after they had died. Widows were not supposed to remarry. All of it was seen as normal. In other words, no one questioned the discriminations that widows were facing. Widow is Vidhava in Nepali, in which women is seen as those without a husband. There is another word for widows called Radi, which is also a synonym for prostitutes. On the one hand, they're expected to be pure. On the other hand, they're seen as a woman who is available for anyone. Whereas none of these applied to men. They were free to remarry after finishing the 13th day of the rituals. During the People's War, thousands of men died. Hence, a large number of women became widows, with over half of them under the age of 40. To help these war widows, some NGOs started working with them. An NGO called Women for Human Rights started a movement called the Red Color Movement. As part of this movement, widows were given red saris, implying that a white sari was a discriminatory cultural practice and that it had no religious significance. Although this movement was not entirely successful because of the backlash from the community, it planted a seed for social transformation. The practice of wearing a white sari had a significant impact on women's lives. In my interviews with them, young widows said they felt insecure and vulnerable in a white sari because they were seen as women without husbands. Hence, they felt increased risk of rape and sexual violence due to the white sari, which symbolized their widowhood. People held different perceptions about them, leading to discriminatory behaviors towards them. Widows expressed that they felt traumatized because the white sari never let them forget their losses. They were also excluded from the public spaces. When widows started gathering and sharing their experiences with the help of some NGOs, they learned that this discrimination was not personal, but cultural, which was a starting point for questioning the toxic practice, the taken for granted discriminatory norms, which widows themselves believed. Slowly, they started avoiding white saris and started wearing other colors. Initially, they were criticized and labeled as bad women. However, with the increasing practice and repeated performance of these widows in other colors, it slowly became normal. Now, the white sari is no longer mandatory for widows. Their presence in public spaces have also significantly increased. Around the year 2000, the current president of Nepal, who is a widow, was seen on television in a white sari. However, by 2015, she was seen on television wearing different colors. Even though widow remarriage is not yet a common practice in Nepal, there have been cases of widow remarrying and being accepted by the society. The changing performance of widowhood has not just meant liberation from the white sari. Widows have experienced changes in many aspects of their lives, such as there are no longer restrictions on what they can eat and what they can do, and they have gained more access to public spaces. It is important to note, however, that the practice of widowhood differs in different ethnic groups within Nepal. And the experience of widowhood also varies depending on the subject position of each individual in the society, which is influenced by many factors such as their education, economic status, age, family values, and so forth. There have been some changes to the gender discriminatory laws as well in recent years because of a strong women's movement in Nepal. The current civil code, which was introduced in 2017, is seen more progressive in terms of women's rights. Widows had to wait until the age of 16 to be eligible for government allowances, but now they can start receiving the allowance as soon as they become the widows. If a widow remarried before, they had to return the property of the deceased husband to the family, to his family, but that is no longer the case. According to the current law, they can retain the property with them even if they marry to someone else. Widows do not need the consent of a male member of their family to obtain a passport now, and widows do not need a permission from their children to sell her own property. So in conclusion, I'd like to reiterate that armed conflict can never be positive. However, it can become a vehicle for women's empowerment. Thank you for listening. I have published extensively on this topic, so you can refer to my book or my recent article published in the Journal of Peace Research, where I have talked about many other kinds of transformations that have taken place. After this presentation, there are two more presentations as part of this tester lecture. These are very small presentations. Each one is only of 2 minutes long. And these presentations are by our guest lecturers who also take classes in this module. After these two presentations, Maureen and I will be happy to take your questions. Thank you. Thank you everyone for listening. As I said earlier in the recorded video, we have 2 more presentations to go. Each is 2 minutes long, so it's very short presentation. Please send your question to us using the Q&A function, and we'll take all of the questions during the Q&A after these 2 presentations. Yasmin, shall we play the two lectures now?
Hi everyone. How do we know if project addresses people's needs if they don't use a gender perspective to better understand people's different needs and interests? I'd like to share with you an example of a project which I've been involved with back in 2014 in the Central African Republic. At the time, Action Against Hunger, or ACF, was in charge of providing water and sanitation services to people affected by conflict and who were living in an IDP camp, IDP standing for internally displaced people. In the camp, ACF established those toilets that you see on the right-hand side of the picture, or latrines. They used plastic sheets to create the walls, and they installed a system of rotation to have water being collected by volunteers in the camp, so to provide a water point. Something they discovered when monitoring the activities is that children in particular were not using the toilets. And so they wanted to understand a little bit better why it was the case, given the huge risk in terms of health for people living in the camp. So they organized focus group discussions with mothers and with children, and they started to understand a little bit better why it was the case that children were not using toilets and continued to practice open defecation, which is the case back in the village. In the village, only rich families use toilets because it takes time and efforts to build latrines, and only rich families such as the chief, for example, would have taking the time and effort to build them. So that's the case, for example, on the right-hand side of the picture. So back in the camps, children were not used to using toilets at all. And so the plastic blue sheet seems like a very foreign material. And also being in a confined space was very uncomfortable for them because it was scary. They weren't sure who was coming, and also the wind created a lot of noise with the plastic used. So what they decided to do with the NGO is to adapt toilets to the children's needs. And they created those lower toilets where children could still see the surrounding. They also had open doors, which was requested by the children, so that they could escape quickly if they needed to. And so that's just one example of how an activity was adapted to different people's needs. And that's an example of why a gender intersectional perspective really matters to better implement projects. There will be many more examples to be shared, and I look forward to sharing them with you. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Kevin Blanchard, and I'll be using my 2 minutes to talk to you about the linkages between the No Natural Disasters campaign, LGBTQI people in disasters, and more generally, why the use of natural to describe disasters is especially bad for marginalized or vulnerable populations. So before we begin, I'd like to ask you a quick question. Which of these applies to you? So you have used natural to describe disasters before. You've never used natural to describe disasters before. Or you can't remember and you don't know. Well, either way, any of those answers is fine. I certainly, in the past, before I learned about the No Natural Disasters campaign, had used natural to describe these events. So on with the presentation. So for those of you who don't know, the No Natural Disasters campaign is run by a group of students, academics, practitioners, policymakers who use online platforms such as Twitter to explain that using natural to describe a disaster is incorrect. Whilst there are hazards that are natural, the resulting disasters are caused by our own cultural, economic, planning, and policy decisions that mean when a hazard impacts on a poorly prepared, designed, or equipped community, that's when it becomes a disaster. Now, in terms of LGBTQI+ people, and more broadly, anyone else who is marginalized in general society, by classifying a disaster as natural, we're effectively allowing people in positions of power to continue to force marginalized groups to live in vulnerable or risk-prone conditions. It's no coincidence that the most vulnerable in our day-to-day society are also the most vulnerable to the impacts of a disaster. And by continuing to label disasters as natural, we're stripping those stories of their social, political, environmental, and economic context, one where injustice is pervasive. So in conclusion, the term natural disaster isn't only incorrect, it's also a barrier in achieving a greater level of preparedness and resilience for all in society. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for listening to all of the presentations. As I said earlier, please post your question to the Q&A section. We already have received a couple of questions, so we'll start answering those. Also feel free to even add your comments if you like to add some comments. So I will start by answering the first question, and then Maureen will take the second question, and we'll go and add if you need to add anything to any of these. So the first question is, was there any evidence of religious organizations empowering women who had lost their spouses in Nepal after the conflict? So there were no religious organizations as such who were involved in creating awareness. But then these NGOs that I was talking about invited various religious leaders, especially local leaders who were respected, well respected in the community, to speak about what was religious and what was just cultural discrimination against widows. Because they were the authentic voice of the community, women trusted them, because initially widows themselves believed that if they did something and that is against the norm, something will happen to their family, because everything had somewhat a religious fear attached to that. So if you did this, your family member will die or something like that. So they felt scared of doing things which were not allowed culturally. So through these kinds of education and training by the local leaders and respected people, including the religious leaders, and various other education related trainings by these NGOs, and through sharing of their own experiences with one another, they found out that this had no religious significance, but it was merely a cultural discrimination against widows, and that it was okay for them to not wear the white sari and not do certain things that they were forced to, or they had to. So this is how things started changing. And again, when I'm saying during my presentation, I said that anything that I'm making claim of today is not to be generalized. I'm making a generic argument based on what you see in general. But then the lived experiences of each individual widow will be very different. Some of them will still be going through various discriminations, whereas others would not have to face any discrimination at all, or a very little discrimination. But then in overall, there have been a huge transformation in the experiences of widowhood in Nepal. So Maureen, could I request you to answer the second one?
Yes, this is a question from Diana, who asks what kind of roles women can play in emergency response beyond the rather kind of traditional ones that they seem most often to be involved in. My answer would be any role. And in fact, they do to a considerable extent. There are a number of very good examples of women taking very active emergency response roles. Often though, there again, we're back to this invisibility issue, and this we discuss quite a lot actually in class when we're doing the module, why it's always seems to be so invisible. But often it's because women are doing this kind of work in a more informal way rather than formally as part of a professional role. And in that sense, it's just seen to be, you know, what women do. They just sort of get on and do whatever it might be. But there are examples, published examples of women rescuing, women being not just a part of various kind of community-based groups, but leading them. Women firefighters and other emergency responders. So there are examples, but sometimes you have to dig for them to find them. And I think to consider this question in the context of COVID-19, there's interesting evidence appearing, certainly interesting attitudes appearing, in which women leaders have been seen to be very effective in their response to the pandemic in rather different ways to the majority of male leaders. It's not as simple as that, but it's indicative, I think, that there's a lot more to be discovered out there.
There is a third question there. Maureen, do you want to just briefly answer that? And then I'll take the fourth. And there are a couple of questions in the chat as well.
The gender research transitioning into government action. There are examples, yes. Again, it took a long time for a lot of this to be translated, and it also relates to partly to the kinds of methods that were used in the research. When I began working in this field, I was working for doing a project for a government agency, and it was largely quantitative, and I insisted on doing a qualitative study. And the person who was the project lead said, Maureen, I really loved reading your report. You know, I read it like a novel, and it was really interesting. Unfortunately, of course, we need the numbers. And at that stage, they were just not ready to accept, in this particular context, these more qualitative studies, which maybe, you know, only included 15 people. So there's quite a complex interplay there of not just the kind of message and the evidence that you're trying to convey, but also the method by which you do that. There's been more evidence now of gender work filtering into a number of fields, a number of government departments. This tends to come and go depending on, for example, who the minister is at any one time and who is pushing what agenda. But there have been some significant policy changes and some insistence on the inclusion of a gender perspective. Sometimes this is what I think of as gender light, in that it allows for people just to do a tick box, acknowledgement of something to do with gender without really doing anything meaningful. But nevertheless, you will now see gender included in across the board, actually, in a number of different departments. We could discuss this more. We have a session around policy issues in our module. In fact, that's 1 week that we cover this.
And we also have written a paper which is under review now, analyzing one of the policies through a gender lens, and in that you will see where are the gaps and where the loopholes are and how gender is mainstreamed in disaster context and disaster policies. We'll keep you posted. Sign up to our newsletter and subscribe to our mailing list, and so that you can get the updates on what we are doing and our new publications. There is another question about when did how long did it take for this change to happen in Nepal, and then are there any other cases in other countries where conflict has led to the transformation? So in Nepal, it is really difficult to say exactly how many years or how many months, but it definitely, all of these things, especially in the case of White Sari and Widowhood, it took about 10 years to really clearly see the changes that was taking place in Nepal. And if you look at the new Women, Peace and Security Index, you'll clearly see that countries coming out of conflict are doing much better in terms of gender rights and gender equality than those who are not, who do not have conflicts. And also, if you look at the data of women's political participation, obviously countries coming out of conflict have more women's participation in politics and then countries without conflict. So this is, again, I mean, not to generalize, and again, not to say that there has to be a conflict in order to have this empowerment and taking place, but the evidence suggests that the conflict could somehow create that kind of enabling environment for women to exercise their agency, and that ultimately leads to the transformation. In my book, I have presented different cases of how the transformation has taken and how it happens. For instance, the case of drivers. So driving profession was not accepted. Driving was allowed in Nepal for women, but women could not drive like public vehicle. It was not accepted occupation for women. But during conflict, they started initial backlash, now very much normalized. I have also talked extensively about women in politics and presented other examples of women in army and things like that. So have a look, and also have a look at many other literatures coming out from various conflict contexts, even in African contexts, who talk about the transformative effects of war. In my new publication, which was published in the Journal of Peace Research, I have talked about some examples from Nepal, and also brought examples from other countries as well. So we have several questions now, and we do not have much time left. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. There is one particular question from Catherine for Maureen. Maureen, do you want to take that question?
Sure. As well as Catherine's, I could also respond to Nidi's question. They're linked actually. So yes, Nidhi, that's absolutely right. Gender equals women in most people's understanding. And whenever you have a gender meeting, gender conference, even a gender lecture, then the majority of the audience are women. We still have to persuade men that they are a gender also, and that actually gender is even more than, you know, it's far more stretched than just this simple binary of men and women, masculine and feminine. The key aspects, I think, relate partly to that, which and it's a topic that's part of our new GRIP project, is to really unpack and broaden our understandings of what gender and intersectionality mean. And it's the intersectionality bit that is the newer area and the greater challenge. It links a little bit to the anonymous question about tools for government and the difficulties actually of understanding how you bring together a number of intersecting characteristics, social groups, but not in just an additive way of first women, then add men, then add race, then add disability, then add, but to look at their intersections, yes, but also the fusion of bringing them together so that you can see people in this holistic way. And that is methodologically and practically quite a challenge to do, because practitioners and policymakers are thinking in list terms and saying, well, first you asked us to look at women, now you want to add race, now you want to add disability, etc. They see it as this almost insurmountable list. So in terms of key work to be done, that is one of the key bits of work that we need to be doing, is to think how we take this beyond the theory into very practical examples for policy and practitioners.
So there is a question in the chat. I just would like to take that question. How is this COVID as a pandemic affecting women positively? Again, I just wanted to present one example from Nepal. So in Nepal, women's political participation has significantly increased since the war and since the peace agreement, and it's 41% at the local level. And when I'm talking about women politicians at the local level, I'm talking about those who have never been to school, cannot even read and write. These women have now become the community leaders and have joined politics. So obviously, because of lack of experiences in politics, as well as their education, they were not seen as somebody who is actually a leader in the community and who can do something for people. They were there as it was perceived by many, just because there was a quota and because of this inclusion and affirmative action, they're there. But in fact, COVID is certainly not a good thing, but some of the women, because I organized 3 webinars, which was attended by like thousands of people with these local women leaders, they said actually it has become, it has a positive outcome for them, because this is the time they have now the opportunity to prove themselves. So people thought, oh, these women are not going to go out at night and help people like men do, because they won't be allowed to go out at home, and they're women, they can't do anything. But these women are proving themselves to be really frontline workers and going and helping people in need. Many people were coming back from various countries soon after the lockdown in March, April, May, and they were actively involved in supporting those returnees, managing the quarantine center, providing relief to the families. So this somehow has become an opportunity for them to prove themselves to their community that they can be useful, and they are the leaders. So this is just one example. If we really look at it, it all depends on our analytical angle and what kind of analysis and analytical angle we are going to use. But if you intend to find these examples, there are plenty in other contexts as well. Is there any, because we are now just 1 minute over, but we can take one more question. Maureen, did you want to take any question from here?
There are two questions. Well, one's a question and one really is a story from Lucia about visibility again, and a very good example of the way women and can be invisibilized in practice. And the other question about whether there are any affirmative action, positive discrimination in favor of women. And I think one of the issues is it's not just to make them visible, but it's to build capacity and provide support so that you don't set up the women who are coming in and set them up to fail, which sometimes you can do if you don't have the frameworks that allow them to show themselves and to show the kinds of work that they're doing. If it's hidden away, and if they're given the tea making, the coffee making, rather than the active responding and rescuing, then that will just reinforce all the time. So it's all of the questions, they really highlight the huge amount of work that still needs to be done. And although we could probably come up with an example of where this has been done somewhere and we do have some good evidence, it isn't the dominant discourse, the dominant situation. So there's still a lot of work to be done, which is why, of course, we put on this module in the first place. And somebody also asked about seeing the PowerPoints, and these films are on the IRDR YouTube channel, so you can go back to them and find them on there.
So there is also a question about what would be the alternative term for natural disasters. Do you want to say something on that, Maureen?
Yes, I think if people are forced to say natural, because they may actually be responding to some other a policy document that already has natural in the title, it's common practice now to put it in scare quotes, in inverted commas, to highlight the fact that you can't just take this as read. But it depends what you're talking about, really. Quite often you might say a disaster with an environmental hazard trigger, for example. Those are the kinds of things you can say. You can make a distinction between the hazard and the disaster, as Kevin said in his short film. Yes, you can talk about a flood risk, you can talk about an earthquake risk. These are hazards that may exist in nature, but it's society and culture that then translates that hazard into a disaster, or not, or stops a disaster from happening because of the understanding of the way these kinds of hazard events can impact different social groups in different ways.
So with this, I think we should wrap up this tester lecture. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope you had you enjoyed the lecture, and if you have more questions, please get in touch. You can find our email addresses, mine and Maureen, on our website. So please email us if you have further questions, and get in touch with anything you'd like to know about the center, about the module, about IRDR, or about our new BSc program. Thank you once again, and see you later.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.